It's 2020. The NFL season is officially over. 5 NFL head coaches were hired this offseason to lead their organizations to a chance at a brighter future. And this man was not one of them. For some of you who may not know Eric Bieniemy, he has been the offensive coordinator for the Kansas City Chiefs the last 2 seasons. He was also the running backs coach the previous 5 seasons. In his first season as the offensive coordinator, his quarterback threw for 50 touchdowns and 5,000 yards. His team went all the way to the AFC Championship game and was just a possession away from the Super Bowl. In 2020, the Chiefs just won the Super Bowl with a dominating offense that has put up scores of 51, 35, and 31 in the playoffs. In all 3 of their wins, they came from behind 10 or more points. We all know that Andy Reid is the captain of the ship, but Reid has the best coaching tree in the league. Matt Nagy, Doug Peterson, and many more coaches learned from the great Reid and now are succeeding in the league. Maybe it's the fact that Bieniemy's not a quarterback guru and came from a run game background. Or maybe we're just making excuses. How did teams that were looking for a head coach not wait around to interview this guy? In 2002, Tony Dungy and Dennis Green were both fired despite Dungy's winning season and Green's first losing season in 10 years as head coach. Dungy's Buccaneers had a top 10 defense and finished with a 9-7 record. Dungy was fired because of the inability to fix Tampa Bay's offense. For Dennis Green, many believed he was fired for his lack of control over the players, especially star receiver Randy Moss. The Vikings were on their way to their first losing season under Green when he was fired after their Week 15 loss to the Green Bay Packers. The firing also came less than a month after owner Red McCombs ensured Green would be back for the next season. Green finished his 10 years in Minnesota with a 97-62 record. He had 8 postseason appearances and 2 conference championship appearances in that span. He was so close to the Super Bowl in 1998 until this happened.
And Anderson hasn't missed in 2 years.
So that's a pretty good bet if you say, do you think Gary Anderson will make this field goal? The answer should probably be yes.
39 yards away. And it's not good. From 39 yards out. Anderson is good. He knows it. They know it.
After the firings is when the Rooney Rule came into place. The rule requires teams to interview ethnic minority candidates for head coaching positions and senior football operation jobs. The rule was named after former Steelers owner and former chairman of the league's diversity committee, Dan Rooney. 2 U.S. civil rights attorneys, Cyrus Mehri and Johnny Cochran, released a study showing that black coaches, despite winning a higher percentage of games, were less likely to be hired and more likely to be fired than their white counterparts. According to the study, there have been 139 openings for NFL head coaching jobs from 1986 to 2001, but only 6 have gone to African Americans. Art Shell to the Raiders, Dennis Green to the Vikings, Tony Dungy to the Buccaneers, Ray Rhodes to the Eagles and the Packers, and Herman Edwards to the Jets. They combined to win 9.1 games a season compared to the 8.0 average for all white coaches during that span of 15 years. They also made the playoffs 66% of the time compared to 39% of the time for white coaches. After this was brought to the league's attention, they made a big step for the future, and the Rooney Rule officially became established in 2003. One of the most prolific coaching trees in the history of the league dates back all the way to the great Bill Walsh. Bill Walsh was the head coach of the 49ers for 10 years and won 3 Super Bowls in his time. In his last season, he had the most prolific offensive staff maybe in history under him. Mike Holmgren was his quarterback coach, Dennis Green was his wide receivers coach, and Sherman Lewis was his running backs coach. After Walsh's retirement, he passed the reins to defensive coordinator George Seifert. Holmgren became the team's offensive coordinator, Lewis stuck around as the running backs coach, and Dennis Green left to become the head coach at Stanford for 3 years before becoming Minnesota's head coach in 1992. In 1992, Green Bay brought in Mike Holmgren as their head coach and brought Sherman Lewis along with him to be the team's offensive coordinator. The Green Bay Packers coaching staff was loaded. Holmgren landed Brett Favre and the Packers never looked back. Their offense was dominant and they appeared in 2 Super Bowls while only winning 1. Mike Holmgren's offensive coaching staff produced many NFL head coaches, but Sherman Lewis never got the call. In 8 years as the offensive coordinator of Green Bay, his offense lit up the league. Here are their offensive rankings in the league under Holmgren and Lewis. While most production probably benefited from Holmgren's mind, it's an absolute shame that Sherman Lewis was never hired. That's not the last of it. 6 white coaches who worked under Sherman Lewis as offensive assistants went on to be head coaches. John Gruden, Steve Mariucci, Andy Reid, Marty Morenweg, Mike Sherman, and Mike McCarthy all were below Lewis, but still, Lewis never got the big gig. So a guy who worked under Bill Walsh for 6 years, Holmgren for 7 years, was the running backs coach when Roger Craig won Offensive Player of the Year, and was offensive coordinator while Brett Favre won 3 MVPs, never got hired. He was a part of 4 Super Bowl titles. How did Sherman Lewis never get the job? Sherman Lewis is not the only coach who has had to go through this sad situation. Tony Dungy, who paved a pathway for black coaches in this league, had struggled for years to land a head coaching job. He was often promoted by Chuck Noll when he was assistant in the 80s with Pittsburgh. He also had an issue with an unnamed organization in the 90s when they had an issue with his mostly black coaching staff. Lovie Smith and Herm Edwards were both part of his staff that led the Bucs to 4 winning seasons in 6 years. Mike Tomlin, who is currently the head coach of the Pittsburgh Steelers, joined Tampa Bay's staff in 2001. Dungy left the following season, and Tomlin made a name for himself in Tampa Bay, being part of the defensive staff that led to one of the best defenses in NFL history. Longtime Bengals head coach Marvin Lewis also had major problems finding a head coaching job, despite his great success as defensive coordinator for the Ravens in the early 2000s. Eventually, when Dungy was hired by the Colts, he brought in Jim Caldwell, who became his successor when he retired in 2008. In his first year, Jim Caldwell led the Colts to a 14-2 record and a Super Bowl. Unfortunately, Caldwell only lasted 3 seasons and was fired after losing Peyton Manning for the entire 2011 season and finishing 2-14. I don't understand how going 2-14 lands on the head coach after he lost his future Hall of Fame quarterback. Caldwell then dealt with another situation after the lack of interviews in 2012 after being the offensive coordinator for the Super Bowl champion Ravens. 8 positions and no one wanted Caldwell. Out of the 8 coaches that were fired in the 2012 season, 2 of them were African American, Lovie Smith and Romeo Crennel. All 8 coaching positions were filled by white coaches such as CFL legend Mark Trestman and Rod Jasinski, while coaches like Lovie Smith and Jim Caldwell and many more black qualified coaches were left hanging for college jobs and coordinator positions. Within the first 10 years of the rule, we really saw major change and proof that black coaches should be hired. In 2003 to 2013, we had 5 Super Bowl appearances from black head coaches, including 2 Super Bowl wins. But here we are, 17 years later, and not much has changed. There were 3 black coaches in the league in 2003, the exact same amount that we have in 2020. We can't let Eric Bieniemy fall into the same boat as many African American coaches have in the past. He needs to be a head coach in this league, and it's a shame that he won't be in the 2020 NFL season. Change needs to happen.